Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode we are going to be diving into the 3 Synchro Cooper S gearbox and getting it assembled. So stay tuned for that. As I mentioned, on today's episode, we are going to be diving into the 3 Synchro Cooper S gearbox. It's a really cool gearbox. There are some quirks, some hard things, some difficulties, all these different things about this gearbox that are going to be pretty interesting to cover on this episode. Now, for those of you who are looking for a full how-to on how to rebuild your own gearbox, I've done 2 different series on that already. One for the remote change gearbox, which is what this one is, and a rod change gearbox rebuild series. That was a lot of words. Now, those 2 videos are very comprehensive. They are multi-part and they have little chapter markers on them. But if you guys want to take a look at those and get a full how-to on how to build your own gearbox, those would be the videos to check out. Now in this video, I'm going to show you guys some of the quirks around this Cooper S gearbox, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff we're going to be putting into it. Now before we get started, I do want to mention that I have launched a ton of new products on the Classic Mini DIY store. We have a huge array of new Classic Mini performance parts. Those are now on the store, whether you want brake lines, a turbo oil feed, new seat brackets, a steering drop bracket. We have the stuff to suit what you're looking for. Now the things I'm focusing on this store are performance and OEM plus style parts. So that's things to make your life better in your Classic Mini, since some of the parts from factory were kind of not so good. So all of that is now on my store, as well as a bunch of new summer merch. So if you want to help support the channel, help support videos like these, head over to store.classicminidiy.com and pick up some stuff. I think you guys will be really pleased with the things I have on there. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to post those in the comment section below. Now, before we get into the actual nitty-gritty of building this box, I do want to just give you guys a quick background. If you haven't seen, this is part of the broader Cooper S 1275 rebuild series I'm doing. This is a full rebuild from a genuine US spec Cooper S. It's very cool, very rare, and a great opportunity to show you guys some of the nuances on these older Cooper S blocks and gearboxes. Now, on today's episode, we are going to be covering the gearbox itself. We won't be getting into the diff today, just the box and the internals of the box. This box is going to be getting a new set of straight cut gears. These are close ratio gears, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when we put those in and why we're putting those in. But the goal of this project is to bring it as close to stock performance as it was when it rolled off the factory assembly line back in the 60s. So step over to the bench with me and let's get dug into the box itself. Now the gears that came out of the engine, like this one right here, and all the gears that come out of a Mini, they have a synchronizer face. This is where your bulk ring, this right here, sits down. And what this does is it's made specifically to help smooth and transition the shifting on your gears. So as your gears are spinning, you have another one that's spinning in a similar motion, but you want to synchronize those so that you can change gears effectively. And the face on this gear, let's see if I can show you guys there, is just super chewed up. Unfortunately, this happens as gears age. This is what actually most times makes a gear unusable, aside from like actually losing teeth. But since that face is so worn down, I just don't feel comfortable putting this into a rebuilt gearbox. And so what that means is that we have to replace these gears with a new set. And getting replacements for those original gears is nearly impossible. They are simply not made anymore. And you know, with these things not being made, specifically that gear ratio, in those helical gears, it just becomes untenable to get something for it. So what we are going to be doing is using a straight cut set from MED. This is a brand new gear, brand new set, and those bulk rings sit right down on there. And the important thing about bulk rings, they have to have a specific clearance between the bulk ring face and the gear face itself. You can see that gap. And if that bulk ring sits all the way down on that gear, most likely it's out of spec, and it's due to the wear of the bulk ring or the wear of the face of the gear. Now, in this case, this is a brand new gear, this brand new bulk ring. The whole purpose of this is to make sure that everything lasts as long as possible, but something that you must check when you're rebuilding your gearbox. Now, I've got most of the stuff laid out here that we're gonna need in order to build this box, but to start off with, what we're gonna be doing is building up the main shaft. This main shaft actually holds all of the gears for your gearbox. This is a 3 Synchro main shaft. They are different than later gearboxes, and I'll show you how in a minute. But we're gonna put all of our new gears on this and get this prepped and built up for the gearbox. So let's put this in the bench vise and we'll start assembling this. Now, the way that this main shaft works is pretty much the same as later style main shafts. However, the races down here that the gears actually sit on, they are a little bit different. They have rollers on them. I'm going to show you this in a minute, but they have rollers instead, these like big metal rollers. Let me just show you one right now. These right here, and they get placed all the way around. Can be kind of a fiddle to do this, and then the gear goes down over it. It's pretty cool how it all works, but there was definitely an improvement between when this was made and when the later gearboxes and later gears got assembled and put together. All right, so for this build, even though those rollers were in pretty good shape, I went ahead and ordered a new set of these just to make sure that we were putting really good working stuff back in here. The one thing I do want to mention about this and about these rollers here is that the easiest way I have found to put this on and to reinstall this is to actually use cam lube, just a little bit of lifter lube here. Whoops, that was a little bit more than a little. And this is going to give a slightly sticky surface for those rollers to sit down on. And you're just going to want to install enough that they go all the way around and stay in place, basically. Okay, so now we have those rollers in place. The next thing we need to do is put the spring that goes inside this little retainer here. A lot of fiddly bits for this part, eh? There are 2 little keepers. These little keepers go on each side, and we're gonna go ahead and put those in. Now it takes a small little spring, just like this, and it goes in this hole right here. And then you'll put the stopper in for the other side from the other side. So now you have that retainer in there. And now for arguably the hardest part, and that is installing the gear itself. All right, so time for the fiddle. What makes this so hard is that you have to actually press in those little retainers while this falls down on there. But in addition to those little retainers making it very difficult to get this pressed in, all of these little rollers want to fall everywhere too. So I'm gonna move the camera. Sorry in advance if this isn't like the most perfect shot. This one is a tough one and requires all of my concentration. No, stop. Whew, that is a very, very irritating thing to do. Would not recommend that to my worst enemy. So the next part is actually putting in our little retainer. Now, the retainer on these 3 Synchro boxes have a little notch in them. And the idea is that these right here hold and retain the little rollers that are still in there. It works, it's just really, really irritating to do. Now, I'm not really sure what the easiest way to do this is, but this will block the notches here, so there's no way for this to slide down into place. You simply have to set these down on top of those rollers, just like that. And then you gotta make sure that your notches are gonna come down in the right place. So, bring that down. Leave it to BMC to make arguably one of the most irritating things to do. Now, in addition to lining those up, you also have to line up the, or rather push in the retainers. All right, so I straight up don't know what the BMC engineers were thinking when they thought of this little retaining clip here. Later model main shafts work a little bit easier, but basically you have to push this little retaining button in while pressing this down so it catches, and then you rotate this so it locks into place. This right here is the size punch that I ended up needing to use. As you can see, I had to bend it in order to get that thing pressed. I would not wish this experience on my worst enemy. That was absolutely brutal, but it's done, it's in place. So now we can continue to assemble the main shaft. Now, the 2 gears are on. These ones are the 2 that actually get retained on the main shaft. The rest of the assembly gets assembled a little bit differently, but I can show you guys, a little bit of how this works. So next up, we're gonna start assembling the synchronizer ring. It's pretty straightforward, and most of this stuff, well, all of the stuff after these gears here, let's pull this up just a little bit. Everything after these 2 gears here actually kind of gets set on loosely, like it can slide on and off of the main shaft, so it doesn't stay on there until it's actually in the gearbox. So we're going to take our synchronizer, and it actually goes on just like this, but we need to put our bulk ring in place. And this is where you would be testing the clearance with this new bulk ring. Now, as you can see here, we've got a nice gap underneath that gear. This needs to be shimmed, and this needs to actually be tested. And the clearance for this should be in your Haynes manual, pretty straightforward. But in this case, you can see, this is a visual representation of what one in good shape would look like. So now we take our synchronizer, this slides down into place, and sometimes you need to give it a little jiggle. There we go. There we go. Cool. So that's looking good. And at this point, this side of the main shaft is actually fully assembled. If this was a 4 Synchro gearbox, this would operate a little bit differently because there would be an additional bulk ring and gear over here to actually, be your first gear. Now with that, we can flip this over. We can start to assemble the other side with the other synchronizer ring. But because this is a straight cut gearbox, I actually got some guidance from MED about this. We actually need to put the first motion gear into the gearbox first with the bearing in place, and then actually put the main shaft in. Apparently there's a kind of an order of operations, all because of the straight cut nature of these gears. I've not installed one of their gear sets yet, so this is going to be a little bit of a learning experience as well. so this is where it's going to get a little bit different than your normal gearbox. Now, most standard gearboxes, you'll have your first motion gear here with the nose on it that sticks out the side of your gearbox, and that can actually come in and slide in from this side. Unfortunately, with the straight cut gears, you are foregoing the ability to do this. And so both of these, first off, this needs to be inserted from the inside first. Now that's going to set there just kind of idly. It's not doing anything right now. Don't forget the needle roller that goes inside that first motion shaft. That's this right here. And that will slide in. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Now, in order to get this big main shaft assembly in, this selector shaft right here was preventing it from going down and setting down in place with this first motion gear in place. So I went ahead and popped this selector shaft loose. I took out the detents on this side of the gearbox. If you want to see how all of that works, I cover that in my remote gearbox build video. But this can then slide out of the way. And in my case, I've already removed the selector. All right, so then we are going to actually set the main shaft assembly in. Now you can see I have a second gear selected here so that this is nice and wide. And then we are going to hold all of this in place with all 45 of our hands. I'm going to slide that down in and set it into place. Now, this can go on the end there. And now we have most of the main shaft assembly in. The last thing that we are going to do is take the selector and slide it in from the bottom. This is arguably the hardest part, only because, well, it's underneath everything. One thing that you'll want to do when you're doing this is slightly lift up the main shaft assembly so that that shaft will slide in. And as you can imagine, I also had the other selectors loosened so that everything could kind of move freely and I could slide this whole assembly back and forth. It isn't going to stay that way, obviously, but to get everything started and working. So we'll get that back in place. You don't want to forget to actually reconnect and bolt up the selector for first and second gear. Definitely don't want to forget that. All right, so we've got that double roller bearing in over here now. I forgot to turn on the camera for that, but I covered that process in my full gearbox rebuild. I mentioned earlier, if you want to see a full start to finish gearbox rebuild, that would be the video to check out. Now, this next part, we are going to be putting in our double roller again. This is the old one. It actually spins pretty okay. It came off pretty good, and honestly, you might be able to get away with reusing this. However, whenever I do a gearbox rebuild like this, I always like to replace this double roller bearing. It maintains the actual rotational force on all of the power that's coming out of this engine. This double roller and the single roller over here, there's just no reason not to replace this. One thing that you're going to want to think about though when you take apart your old gearbox is these double rollers have a retaining ring. It kind of looks like a piston ring, and they don't come with the new bearings. This one piece can hold up an entire gearbox rebuild if you don't remember to take this off of your old one. Very, very annoying if you run into this issue. Put that on, it clips around the double roller bearing into this groove. I'm going to do that real quick, and then we'll set this into the gearbox. Now you can see there's a small gap in the double roller right there, but this is going to slide in like this over your main shaft, and it's going to slide into place to support this end of your gear. Now this is a little bit finicky spot, but you are going to want to make sure that you apply even force to this thing. You can get two pieces of tube that will apply even force on the inner race and the outer race, because you don't want to apply uneven force. If you don't have one of those, sometimes you can get away with hammering on the inner race, outer race, inner race, outer race, all the way around very slowly. This is a perfect example of slow and steady wins the race. Now I'm going to pop this on here, and then we will move on to the next part, which is putting in the lay gear and the lay shaft. All right, so now we've got that double roller in there, and it's looking really good. You'll notice there's still a small little gap here, and that is just a little bit of play on both sides of this gear main shaft assembly. They just need to cinch in a little bit. And the easiest way to do that, you can sit here and hammer away at this thing for ages, But what I've found is it's easier to go ahead and put the lay gear in, engage 2 of the gears at the same time so this can't move. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. And then we'll utilize the existing nut here to effectively pull, so it'll pull the shaft this direction as you tighten this down here. I find that it's easiest to do that. That way you can kind of pull it in and it works more like a press than beating away at gears or shafts or anything like that. It just seems to be a little bit better for the whole gear assembly. So let's talk about the lay gear. Now, these early 3 Synchro boxes actually have a different set of shims on the edges here. Now, these go on each side here and set a certain amount of clearance on the actual lay gear that sits down in place. Now, these are very old-fashioned ones. The later ones don't look like this. They change a little bit. The tab, I think, is in the center, if I recall. Yeah, so the later ones moved to a single tab, looks something like this. Pretty much the same deal. It sits down in place and sets a certain amount of shim and clearance for that gear. So the way I like to do this, it's kind of fiddly. First things first, make sure that your reverse shaft hasn't slid out. In my case, mine had. We're going to go ahead and put that back in. And then we are going to grab our lay gear, which in our case is this straight cut lay gear, looking pretty slick. And we're going to need to put roller bearings in here. Now, an interesting little tidbit I want to mention to you guys is the difference in the roller bearings between this early style and later style rollers. So you'll see this is the original helical gear set, and I have a small little retainer thing here. Now, at this point in time, these needle roller bearings are the only ones they sell, and they're a little bit taller. You can see that's pretty big. Unfortunately, it looks like I no longer have the original ones. They were in really, really rough shape, so I must not have kept them. But this had a small little retaining ring down in here, and the roller bearing actually was a little bit less tall. So you can see there, that sticks out a little bit. So if you're rebuilding one of these early style gearboxes, you're going to want to reach in here and pull that retainer out so that you can use your brand new needle rollers and they will slide right in and you won't drop them in the gearbox. And you can see here, they'll slide right in. That looks really good and it's flush to the face. Now this is the same thing on the straight cut gears, slides right in, perfectly flush. But if you had, for whatever reason, some new old stock ones of those other needle rollers, I don't know that this retainer, well, that retainer does sit down in there. You could probably use the retainer in here and use the original ones if you had some laying around, but if I were you, I would just get brand new ones. A little bit easier, and these retainers will slide right out. So anyways, gonna put my brand new needle rollers in. That's one on this side, one on this side. They are going to be the same, and we are going to rotate this down in there. But wait a minute, that's just kind of flopping around. You would be correct, and the reason that is 2 reasons. One, we don't have our lay shaft in there yet. I'm going to go ahead and slide that in. You can slide that in from either side. Sometimes one side will work a little bit better than the other. And go ahead and set these shims in here. Alrighty, so we've got this lay gear in, and unfortunately it was extremely difficult to get everything lined up. Maybe it's just the tolerances of these straight cut gears. Once everything was lined up, it's very happy in here. But before that, it was definitely a challenge. So as you can see, I've got my center oil pickup. That went in at the exact same time. Everything kind of rotates into place, and you set and check the shim between your thrust washer here and the actual gear. Once you have that in place, this is where you can actually kind of engage 2 gears at the same time. I'm going to leave this loose for right now. One thing I do want to do is kind of get down in there and move that bottom end of this oil pickup kind of into the center, as its name suggests. Now that all lines up pretty nicely. I'm going to leave that loose for right now. And to actually tighten these bolts down to spec, specifically the one on the end of the main shaft and the one on your first motion gear on the other side, you are going to need to engage 2 gears at the exact same time. All right, so I had to pull this off camera in order to do this, but this right here is your first and second gear synchronizer. This has been pushed into first gear, so it's engaged with the lay gear here. And then we have our other Synchro, the 3rd and 4th gear one, pressed into 4th gear at the same time. And so that, as you can see, locks up the gearbox. Now to start off, let's go ahead and just set this main nut on here, hand tight, slide that down. And you'll notice I didn't put a washer on there either. This is not where it's gonna live permanently. And then we're gonna take our first motion gear and put it in on the other side. And that should slide down on. We'll take the nut for the first motion gear, put that on as well. And again, I'm just doing this finger tight. I just don't want that to move out, do anything that it shouldn't, just want that to stay in place. Now I can get to zipping up this main nut right here. The way I'm gonna do that is with my impact gun. Now this nut right here takes an insane amount of foot poundage in order to tighten it down. We're gonna tighten it down just a little bit with the gun, and then we'll come back, torque it down. But for right now, I'm gonna zip that up. And for those of you who are curious, this is a 1.5 inch socket, and I got a deep one because it's easier to get that over. All right, now you might have seen that started spinning, and the reason that happened is because I don't have my detent springs in for my selectors yet. So now that I have this kind of cinched down a little bit, I am gonna go ahead and put my detent springs in, as well as the little detent knobby thing. So let me show you what that is. Now on the back side of these remote gearboxes, you have something a little special. Rod changes are totally different. This doesn't exist on a rod change. But you have these little detent plugs. These go in round side down towards the actual selectors. And these go in just like that. And they take a bolt and a copper washer to tighten it down into space. All right, so now we have this cinched down. It's pretty tight, it's in place. The next thing that we did was install our little retainer here. This retainer just retains the double roller bearing in place, and you have a little tab that keeps your two shafts, your lay shaft and your reverse gear shaft, in place. And with that, this is pretty much done. The only thing we need to do now is torque this big honkin' nut up to its torque spec and torque the first motion nut as well. And of course, we want to bolt in our center oil pickup. We'll need a gasket over here, a bolt over here, and we'll be in good shape. After that, the box is almost done. So we're reaching kind of close to the end of this part of the build. Pretty exciting stuff. Now this next part is a kind of fun and unusual part, and I know you guys are gonna give me so much shit for having these sandals on, but I just don't really care. Now the third motion nut, the big nut on this side, on the end of the main shaft, that needs to get torqued down to 90 foot-pounds. And the first motion shaft, the first motion nut over here, that one also needs to get down to 90 foot-pounds. Now this is actually kind of a hard thing to do, especially when you don't have a jig. For most of us though, we don't have that set up, and what we'll be doing in this case is flipping the gearbox upside down. Both gears are still engaged, so the main shaft can't spin. And what we're gonna be doing is effectively standing on the case in order to get this torqued up to spec. Now, this is gonna work a little bit better the heavier you are. I am not an especially heavy person, so for me, this is kind of difficult, but this is one of those situations where size does in fact matter. Now we'll put our torque wrench on our main nut here. You'll need that deep well socket, and we are going to stand on this case and get it torqued to spec. So there's one side in place. Now we just need to repeat the exact same steps on the other side and get that torqued in place as well. Sweet. So my impact gun did get those into place and at the right torque spec already. So with that, we can flip up the little lock tabs on them. I'll show you how I do that. And then we can start assembling this some more. All right, so I think that's where I'm gonna kind of wrap this up today. We are still waiting on what was out of stock, some diff carrier bearings. Those have not yet arrived, and I have to repaint some stuff here. This little Speedo housing and rather the speedometer takeoff didn't get painted. It was hidden in a little parts bin. So I set it there so I don't lose it. You probably noticed that when I was assembling it, but we're gonna wanna take that off and repaint it green so that it matches the original colors of this engine. So on the next episode, we are gonna get into the differential, the whole drop gear housing. I'm gonna show you guys how all that goes together, or at least we're gonna tackle the job here on the channel. If you guys have any questions about this build or about this gearbox, please post those in the comment section below. If you see anything that is not totally period correct, or maybe you have some guidance you'd like to share, this build is all about making sure that this is 100% period. So it's very important to me, but also the owner of this engine, that we get everything just right. So if you have any guidance, please share that in the comment section. I love to hear the kind of nuances around this Cooper S box, Cooper S block, all the different things. Now, as I said, that is gonna wrap up today's episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I thank you so much for tuning in. And until I see you guys on the next episode of Classic Mini DIY, you guys know the drill. Enjoy those minis and motor on.